Hi, this is Gordon Hisayasu, and I'm trying to put together chapter 5, which is on life. I woke up this morning and I realized one of the great wonders of life is that I am alive, and I have been for 73 years, which is pretty amazing. But this topic of life is really difficult for me. It's actually almost too big of a topic. I started reading about the definition of what scientists think life is, and I found a lot of papers on it, long papers. In other words, it's pretty hard for them to define life. And I've looked at the origins of life, and I've looked at the history of life, maybe in evolution or anthropology. And part of my formal education is the bachelor's in biology. Biology is supposedly the study of life, but I love physiology and especially love genetics. And these are all big, big aspects of what life is, and it makes it very, very complicated, even things like the philosophies of life. And so I found out that in my life journey, what I have come to realize is that God is the one who gave me life. And that's a pretty profound statement. The Bible says very simply that God breathed life into us, and that's simple but very mysterious. And it basically cannot be proven. It doesn't. There's never going to be evidence to prove that. You need to believe it. On the other hand, what does science have to do? Science really, based on its own definition, has to come up with a natural cause. And I'm going to try to start with what they call abiogenesis, which is the origins of life, or from changing inanimate to animate. And it's kind of a strange study. I've probably read pieces of it throughout my whole life, and it's kind of a mixed bag. I think it starts out with the idea that they have to have this prebiotic soup, which is pretty hard to explain in itself. The idea of a prebiotic soup means that there has to be circumstances on Earth where these compounds can come together and can be formed by some kind of mechanism. And these mechanisms have been things like an electric spark, or they've been things like possibly being in volcano pools or volcanic pools, sort of like you see at Yellowstone. And they've had theories about it being formed out of clay. And there are a few others. It's like possibly it's from the heated sulfur vents that we see in the ocean. And they've even gone so far as to say that maybe it's something that comes from outer space. So we look at science trying very, very hard. And before I even talk about it much more, I'm going to tell you that I think that science leads us very much astray. It kind of gives us a false thinking about we know what life is, or we know what it's about, because we're not even close. And I think that it's kind of a false impression that we get from science. Because what science is really trying to do is it's trying to make life, or try to explain how life possibly came about. And what they're really doing is, they look for these things called amino acids, which are part of life. Amino acids are in everything, and everybody that's alive, or everything that's alive, has amino acids. But amino acids are just a nitrogen and two hydrogens and a carbon, and that's attached to a carboxylic acid, they call it, which is a COOH. And and then there's other molecules attached to that carbon. And they say, well, that's an organic compound. That's the start of life. If we can form those things, we've started life. But don't get organic compounds confused with organisms. I took organic chemistry in college. And organic compounds means simply it contains carbon. And amino acids and organic compounds are a far cry from life. So if you really want to talk about the building blocks of life, you really need to get into a much more complex structure, something like DNA. Okay, and DNA is considered one of the fundamental building blocks of life. And it's kind of strange because I've heard the scientists trying to explain all their theories that I just talked about, and they say that they are basically scientifically unsubstantiable. In other words, they can't be proved, and they're not even close to being proved. So they're kind of vague theories, to be honest with you. But what makes it even more difficult is that what we're really looking at when we talk about life is we're talking about DNA. And DNA has the ability to create all these fundamental processes of life. Definition of life are things like it has to have growth, it has to be able to reproduce, it has to be able to adapt, it has to be able to react to stimuli and metabolize. And so, I mean, there are more other definitions because that's controversial in itself. But basically, the function of DNA is to do all of these things. And we know of DNA simply as a double-stranded helix compound that exists in chromosomes, say. And it's pretty simple, but through all my life, they've never been able to come close to synthesizing the DNA. They've synthesized insulin, and things like that, which are pretty amazing. That our chemistry has come a long way, and our ability to manipulate chemistry has come a long way. But DNA, they can't even come close to it. But the process or the thought that I have really is that even if they could synthesize or make DNA, would it come to life? Where is God's breath of life? What makes compounds come to life? And that's really one of the big problems. If you look at it another way, we live on this earth, and this earth is full of DNA. We're all DNA. When we die, our DNA doesn't disappear, but we are dead. We're not alive. And basically DNA is laying all over the earth, and even in terms of roadkill. So the planet is full of DNA. It's not full of live DNA. So something else animates that DNA to life. And they haven't got a clue, the breath of God that breathes life into us. They don't have a clue what science can say about that. There's another factor that has always been on my mind, and that is that DNA is the only fundamental building block to life on Earth. And it's in bacteria, and it's in trees, and it's in us. And we all have those things that allow us to actually be alive. But there is only one plan that we know of, one, code or one way that life exists, and that's by DNA. And we live on this fantastic planet, and we have all of these different options with perfect life conditions. I've heard that a scientist say that there are 200 really things or requirements you need for life, not just the 4 that I mentioned when we talked about exoplanets. But there are 200, he said, but I believe there are a lot more than 200. My doctor once told me that I needed to have more vitamin D in me or I would get sick, and if I didn't have any, I would die. So there are a lot of conditions you need to have life. But there is one formula for life, and that's DNA, and there is one God. And we don't have, even though we have the perfect privileged planet, we don't have a lot of other different types of life forms. So scientists should look at that too. Why are they looking at these planets and hoping that some of these minimum conditions apply when we have the maximum conditions on Earth, and we still have only one formula for life? And so it becomes really interesting when we look at what DNA is to life. It's a thing that makes you alive. It's a part of every part of you. I'm going to talk a little bit about genes and a little bit about chromosomes later. But DNA has the secret codes. It's encoded, they call it, it's encoded to make proteins and other things that are necessary for life processes. And it is a miraculous, wonderful thing. That it's just very, very complex beyond our imagination. And I will try to talk about that in the further studies. And like I said, this life is beyond the scope of this kind of video, but I'm going to try to talk a little bit more about it in the future. Thank you.